It was a very vibrant cultural moment where gossip, celebrity news, information was part of the currency of the time.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. Smash hit historical romance Bridgerton returns to our screens this week. And one of the series' key characters is the elusive Lady Whistledown, a savvy wordsmith with a penchant for causing mayhem among the elite of the Regency ton. But did any anonymous gossip mongers like Lady Whistledown really exist in the Regency era? Well, Emily Briffett spoke to the public historian Professor Hannah Greig, who's the historical consultant to Bridgerton, to delve into the outrageous world of Georgian scandal sheets and gossip rags, and learn more about who exactly dished the dirt.
Hi Hannah, thank you so much for joining me on the History Extra podcast.
Hi Emily, thanks for having me.
So today we are going to be delving into the world of Regency gossip and scandal. Now, in Bridgerton, we are introduced to the concept of scandal sheets. Now, I wanted to ask you, were these a real thing? Were they a big deal as well?
Well, scandal was definitely a big thing in Regency England. I mean, it has sort of been described as the age of scandal. And that's partly because there was this very kind of buoyant culture of news and information, which had been building, for the century before, with the production of daily newspapers, information in those newspapers. And then combined with that was this culture, this world of the ton, who were the celebrities of the day. So, it was a very vibrant cultural moment where gossip, celebrity news, information was part of the currency of the time. And so you do get a lot of reporting in different forms of people's comings and goings, of who's dancing with who at a ball, who's been going to court, who's been seen at the theatre, what sort of goings on are happening in this high society world. And some of that gossip happens in the newspapers. Some of it happens in kind of magazines. So Town and Country magazine was a classic place people went to for information about relationships and affairs. And then there was the kind of satirical culture where people's identities or their lives were pilloried in other sorts of either print form or visual form. So this is the kind of long historian's answer to saying that there's a lot of information about scandal and a lot of ways of accessing gossip and news, but there's actually nothing quite like the Lady Whistledown papers. And that's because what happens in the Whistledown papers is that people are named very clearly. So we hear about the Bridgertons and the Featheringtons, and people are listed by name. In the way in which scandal was reported at the time, people's names were usually disguised, either under pseudonyms that would be easily recognisable to people in the know, or just by giving initials of people, because that was to protect the authors from libel laws. But in the wonderful Bridgerton novels and in the adaptation, we do know exactly who is being named in the Lady Whistledown papers, I think partly to help us keep track of the comings and goings of this complex world.
Obviously, as you said, we're introduced to this fabulous character of Lady Whistledown, whose scandalous writings bring the lives of the ton really to a halt, and they really sow the seeds of chaos. So you're saying that in the Regency period, there wasn't really quite the equivalent of Lady Whistledown?
Well, there isn't quite the same thing as this one person producing a regular pamphlet that's just about society news. So you get the news that's filtered in the newspapers, but there were women who were actively involved in sharing and communicating the gossip of the time. So, I mean, one of the things we see emergent in the Regency period is the rise of what's called the society novel, where you could have a novel-length description of the goings-on of this high society world, where the characters in the novel are supposed to be fictional, but they're actually drawn from life. And then sometimes their identities are kind of gradually revealed to the reader through the process of the story. And then maybe 6 months later, you could buy yourself a key, so like a decoding of who the characters were in real life. And so there is a kind of world in which women are writing news about the world in which they're living in, these high society women, that is commercial, it's about gossip, it's about scandal, it's all of the things that Lady Whistledown is doing and what she's about. But it often comes out in a slightly different format. So rather than your weekly Whistledown paper, you get a novel, or you get a tip off to the newspaper, or you get it in some other kinds of form. But there are definitely women involved in that world as writers, some of them earning money as writers, in the way that we see happening in the Bridgerton series.
Would it be fair to say that in society there was almost this thirst for gossip and juicy details?
I think it's definitely fair to say that. I think we would all be aware of how, news about famous people, about people in the celebrity eye, is part of a very long-standing media culture. And, we tend to think of it as something that's particularly unique to our modern world. But actually, from the kind of emergence of the newspapers, particularly the emergence of a daily press and the development of a world where there was this celebrity culture living in London, those things, were feeding off each other in interesting ways from a very early kind of historical period. So yes, there was a hunger for news, there was a hunger for information. Some of it was about, if you within this high society world, monitoring the comings and goings of your own, social network, as we see in the Bridgerton series, where Lady Whistledown is a part of the world that she's reporting on. But, there's also a hunger for news and information from those young women who are in Bath or in the provinces, interested in London fashions, interested in London kind of celebrity culture. And they too would be following the comings and goings of this fashionable world. And so most newspapers had a kind of column of information that was called fashionable intelligence or something like that, which was exactly just about reporting about the comings and goings of the London season, about its social life, about its politics, about who'd come into town, who'd left London, who'd had a baby, who was engaged, who was going to get married, who danced with who at the ball, as part and parcel of the news culture of the time.
In this episode, I don't think we can really avoid talking about the explosion of print culture in this era. Why was this so influential in the rise in popularity of spreading gossip?
Well, there's two things which really kind of fuel a world of print and news. So one is in the late 17th century, so sometime before, there's just a lapsing of a licensing act which had kind of restricted the amount of print that could be produced previously. That just kind of ends. So suddenly there's a freedom in the amount of material and the kinds of material that can be produced. And there's also, over the course of the century, a technological revolution that means it's possible to print things more rapidly on a greater scale. And it's this combination of two things together that really kind of fuels this world of print culture. And it is just remarkable the amount of stuff that is produced and the amount of material that still survives in terms of newspaper, pamphlets, novels, poems, every form of print which you could possibly want to find as a historian. Probably any story about anything you can probably find in some format in this world of 18th century print. It is just kind of remarkable, this explosion of the world of the word and the way in which it impacts so many people's lives, and it becomes integrated into this world, this social world of this London scene as well. And it is, I'm always surprised by what new thing there is to find. And so, particularly when you're working, with dramas or something like that for television, there's always a story that you want or some kind of pamphlet you think, oh, if only somebody had produced the life story of this highwayman. And then you can find it because chances are, if there's an interesting tale to have been told from the 18th century, it will have made its way into print in some form. And so it is just kind of incredible, really, to think about how that world changed over the course of the 18th century and the run up to the Regency period, where print became, and the printed word just became so accessible in so many different forms. It is a kind of revolution of the scale of the internet, in our generation and the generation before, and the kind of rise of social media, that kind of complete sea change in access to information. We see that in the run up to this period.
You mentioned this a minute ago, but could you tell us a little bit more about the other societal factors that led to this golden age of gossip?
The golden age of gossip, as you so kind of beautifully phrased it, is it's kind of about this combination of things. So it's about having the media that makes it possible. So the development of a print culture, and then an interest in the news that might be considered to be part of this kind of celebrity or gossip culture. So we have this emergence of this world, this fashionable society who are very high profile, who are living a fast London life. They come to London primarily actually for the political season. They are the ruling political elite. but they are required to be resident in London every year in order to meet the needs of politics and the court. And so it's that regular kind of attendance in London, the bringing together of this group, the kind of concentration of this community of people in one place for a long period of time, means that, there's a lot of information that becomes available about their comings and goings, about people who see them in different places. We have insight into journalists who go and hang out at the pleasure gardens just to witness who's there, who's walking with who's talking to who. Journalists have kind of information to people on the inside who share news about how much they spent on their party, who was on the guest list. There's a kind of leaking of information to the press. And so, it creates this golden age of gossip.
So we've spoken about some of the things that might have been contained in these gossip columns or scandal sheets. But could you give us a bit more depth? Can you give us some interesting examples of what we might have expected to have found if we went back to the Regency era?
Well, the heartbeat of gossip was marriage, affairs, relationships, love, and sex. And so, a lot of the information is about who's eligible on the marriage market, who is likely to be married by the end of the season, who has been disappointed in their marriage matches, and then subsequently, marriages that are falling apart, people who are seen with other people, kind of rumours of affairs, rumours of sexual scandal. Like, that is the kind of currency of a lot of the kind of commentary around this world of news and gossip. And it has a number of elements, I suppose. One is about, marriages and making of marriages is about families coming together. It's about the construction of power networks. There's a real kind of business to marriage amongst the elite that is important in terms of power and status. And then, the falling apart of marriages, the rumours of affairs, of illegitimate relationships or relationships with with poor consequences, they also have a significance to how the society operates that's more than just a kind of scurrilous sort of sneering about people's private lives. It is also about power and property, about, who's an heir to an estate and who's not, who's behaving in the way that would be expected of this high society world. And when you start to dig into some of that gossip, then actually what you begin to find is that sometimes significantly the codes of conduct that are expected of women are very different to the codes of conduct that are expected of men. So men have a much greater freedom in terms of their love lives, their relationships, whereas women, if they become subject to scandalous reporting in the press, it can have a massive impact in terms of their standing and their status in society.
Would we say this is a high stakes affair, or was it more of a frivolity?
I would describe it as a high stakes affair. And in that, the kind of the more serious historical reading that you can do of some of these scandal sheets, although they are fun to read and interesting and fascinating, is actually the moment in which a scandal becomes public in the press is really the moment in which it starts to have quite a big impact on the lives of the people involved. So, there are some cases of aristocratic women who, have been rumoured to have an affair, and then they are exiled from this London society world for quite a long time if that affair becomes public knowledge in the newspapers. And so, as a historian, if you read the public scandal sheets alongside private letters and diaries, there is also quite a lot of effort that happens in the high society world to hide things from the press, things of real importance, or things that might potentially lead to somebody, suffering a social exclusion. There is an effort to kind of bury it, to hide it, to send them to Bath for 6 months until the gossip dies down. And so, we can recognise some of these strategies in a modern media world as well. And I think it's important to try and retain some sympathy for the subjects of these scandal sheets in the Regency era, in the same way that we should retain sympathy for subjects of kind of news gossip today, because we do see an impact in terms of their life, their status, and their future, depending on how they're being reported in the press.
Could you tell us more about some of the strategies people may have used to prevent these details of their life leaking out onto the public stage?
there'd be one of two things. One would be keeping up appearances. So, being seen in public, with your spouse, being reported as hosting parties and events, a kind of public communication of ongoing standing in the kind of the world of the ton. So one is keeping up appearances. That's one approach. Another approach is just lie low for a while. So you spend a year back at your country seat, you keep out of the London season, you say that you're kind of, busy with your children, or suddenly interested in botany and horticulture, or maybe you've gone to France for the year. And just kind of keeping out of sight was another kind of tried and tested strategy as well.
Were there any libel laws, perhaps, that could have prevented the publication of these sheets?
Yes, there are libel laws that active at the time, and that's one of the reasons why we don't have the exact Lady Whistledown equivalent, which is naming of names, because the moment in which people were actually named in terms of gossip and scandal, then it's possible that the author of that newspaper, the publisher of the newspaper, would be subject to kind of some kind of libel proceeding. But the way to circumvent that was to imply with strong hints of who an individual was, or to just give their initials, but never actually say. So, for example, Lord Bridgerton might just be LB or Lord B in a gossip column, or they might make some kind of, I'm going to make some terrible attempt at a pun now, which is going to fail badly, but they might try and create some kind of pun around someone's name or some kind of hint. So they would talk in some way about a bridge or something like that, and they would imply that there's a bridge involved, and the reader would then infer that it was discussing a Bridgerton member of the family. And so they would, in the Regency terms, they would try and make a clue to a name or give the initials of a name, but never actually say the name, because that was the main defence against some kind of, against a libel proceeding.
Thinking back about the content of these scandal sheets, these gossip columns, who were the chart-topping headliners of Regency England that were reported about in them?
At the top of the kind of the news ladder, I suppose, would be the kind of fashionable lady hostesses who were running the balls and the parties, who were the kind of gatekeepers of this world. So we have high-profile women like Lady Jersey, who is one of the hostesses of the subscription assembly room called Almack's. She's right at the heart of London society. Like, who's invited to her parties, who she's turning away, who's seen in her company, would all be part and parcel of a kind of news culture of the time. Alongside these very kind of fashionable and glamorous and quite powerful women, there were members of the royal family. They would always be a point of interest and news. So the Prince of Wales particularly was always kind of in the centre of these news columns. So he'd be at the heart of it. And then we'd have the kind of, rakish dukes and young men, the kind of people who are hanging out at the men's clubs on St James's, like White's and Brooks's. If they were gambling, if they were at the horses, if they were seen in the company of particular women at the theatre, and what kind of rank of women they were socialising with. So, some of those men might be eligible bachelors on the marriage market, so they would be seen in the company of women who might potentially become a spouse, but they might also be seen in the company of women who were kind of high-class courtesans or mistresses, who would also be openly reported in the newspapers. And then you'd get the kind of celebrities of the day who were very high profile in the social resorts that this society world operated in. So particularly actresses and opera singers and dancers, the kind of women who became famous for their professional skill as well. And sometimes they became the kind of love interest of some of these celebrity gentlemen too. So, and good example would be someone like Elizabeth Farron, who was an actress, and this man, the Duke of Derby, became completely besotted by her. He was married to a very beautiful and lovely duchess, but he just fell in love with Elizabeth Farren. And there are caricatures of him following her around, just kind of fawning over her, going to every show, kind of reported in the gossip columns as sitting in the box, almost drooling as he's watching her on the stage. And so that was the kind of content of some of these kind of scandalous columns and news reports, would be about the comings and goings of those people who were very much in the public eye.
And did all of these stories tend to be true, or were some maybe a bit falsified or a bit made up?
No, they do actually tend to be true. I'm just thinking about that. It's a really interesting question. And I'm just pausing because as a historian, I wonder if I have looked for the news about things that I've known to be true from aristocratic papers. So, for instance, I would know as a historian that the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Derby eventually kind of disintegrated. So I then go to the newspapers to look for precursors of it. So I'm searching for something that I know to be true, or whether there is always a grain of truth. And on my suspicion, actually, just as you put me on the spot, would be that they do tend to be true, that it's not just a kind of gossip for gossip's sake, that it is actually a reasonable and fairly reliable barometer of what is happening in that high society world. I think that's partly because the world itself is quite small and enclosed, and it's just London. It's this London society scene. So it's probably, there's enough real juicy information there to keep this currency of news operating. They don't have to make anything up. But, there's been a couple of times where I've read a scandalous report, a bit of gossip that's been so coded in terms of, how it's been written. So there's been a quote from Shakespeare and then some random reference to some other place. And for all of my best efforts to kind of interrogate and analyze it with all of my academic skill, I've never been able to figure out exactly who they're talking about. So sometimes the inside knowledge is so great that you just can't replicate it. And then I have no way of knowing whether or not what they were saying was true because I don't know who the person is. I have no idea exactly what they're talking about. And so you can, as a reader of some of this information, you do feel the distance of time. It feels, understandable and modern in that we understand how news and media and gossip and kind of culture works. But because the people are removed from us, we don't always quite understand exactly who they are or what the issue or the gossip precisely is. And there's been a couple of times where, even though I've read these papers and know this world inside out, I still have not got what the clue is. So, in that case, you've got no idea what's going on anyway. It could just be total nonsense, really. But yeah, I think most of the time it's true. Sorry, long answer to a simple question.
No, that's a really interesting historian's take on all this scandal and gossip of this era. I wonder, it makes me intrigued about the authors behind all this gossip and rumour. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about them? Would they have been the type of people who would have seen these events of high society?
I think so, definitely. I mean, there's definitely a culture of seeding information in the press. So not always the kind of scandalous gossip, but certainly people seeding information to sort of raise their profile. So it wasn't uncommon for it to be reported to a newspaper exactly how much somebody spent on their outfit that they were seen in at court, or exactly how much they spent on a party and exactly how that party, took place. And it's almost like those sort of spreads they used to do in magazines like today of celebrity weddings and celebrity parties, where quite clearly there's a collusion between, the magazine and the people, where they're giving them the information that they feel that's how they want their reputation to be presented in the press. There's certainly a bit of that going on. So, you will read a news report about such so-and-so's party, and it's so precise and so detailed with exactly the number of acrobats that were hanging in the trees that that person's written into the newspapers and said, please publish this. I just want everyone to know how much I spent on my amazing party and what a fabulous time everybody had. And so there's a kind of, there's a seeding of information, and there's definitely an attempt to collect gossip. So a kind of, there's this a lovely caricature from the late 18th century, so slightly before our Bridgerton time. It's an image of the pleasure gardens, Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, And in it are the kind of celebrity figures of the day, so the dukes and duchesses, the Prince of Wales, and then hiding behind the trees and in the crowd are the newspaper editors, and actually shown in this image as watching this world with a view of then putting it in their newspapers the next day. And so that has a kind of sense of the spirit of how some of this information was gathered. We know that someone like the caricaturist James Gilray, who produced a lot of the satirical images that we see, the visual images from the early 1800s, he, lived above the shop in St. James's Street. He drew sketches from life of people that he saw on the street. He goes to Parliament. He takes caricatures of politicians. A lot of his visual work is done from life, and he is a witness of what's happening in the streets and the areas that surround him. And so again, that gives a kind of sense of the closeness of how this world of news is operating in the physical proximity of the people, of the high society people who are the subject of the news. They're not in any way kind of particularly far about. They're all thrown in together into this kind of London cauldron in a few streets, in a few kind of party zones, and the journalists and the caricaturists and the writers are there as well. And then the other category of person I suggest is kind of writing this stuff is we do have, some of the women themselves who are party and privileged to this high society scene. So effectively our Lady Whistledowns. We know that they are novelists. So there are some who are very successful in producing society novels of the time. So women like Lady Charlotte Bury, she produces a number that are kind of satires of the world of the pleasure garden and the assembly room and the marriage market. Her novels are called things like The Flirtation or The Separation. And she is creating a broadly fictional world that's very much based on her experience of her kind of factual life, with these thinly veiled caricatures of or stereotypes of the people that she is surrounded by. And, I'm sure that there's cases of these women writing in other places too. So there's a very successful publication called the Ladies Magazine, which some English literature scholars, including Professor Jenny Batchel, have worked on a lot. And some of the material in that is anonymously written, but we can see the skill and the style of some of these other kind of lady novelists writing in these other genres too. So I'm sure some of their material will be in other places, but they don't always name themselves as the author. Sometimes they're uncovered later.
Obviously, these publications are really going into detail about some of the interesting aspects of life in high society at this time. Did publications ever vie for popularity with their readers at all?
I'm sure they did. I mean, there's a very competitive commercial marketplace of newspapers, and in the decades before the kind of Regency, so in the later 18th century, there is this absolute kind of explosion of newspapers with the production of kind of a daily press. And by the time we get to the kind of Regency period, the early 1800s, most major towns in England have a daily newspaper as well as potentially weekly newspapers. And a lot of the news that you see, like in a newspaper, for example, from York, might also be a column that was taken from a newspaper in London. So there's a kind of circulation of information across these presses as well that is taking place. And yes, there's definitely competition between publishers in order to create the biggest commercial success. And quite a few publishers work across different kinds of print forms. So they'll have newspapers, but they'll also produce pocketbooks, which is the kind of little diary information that you carry around, which has useful things like how much it costs to get a carriage from Westminster to the river, but also a little section where you write your engagement, so your social diary, your accounting, so keeping track of all of your money and your expenditure. They also produce these kind of guides, these pocket diaries that available on the market as well. So there's a very kind of fascinating and vibrant commercial culture of print, and the content of the newspapers is important to their success. And you see a nice spread of information that's about kind of politics, a little bit of international news, quite a big chunk of this kind of high society gossip, and then advertisements for all kinds of intriguing and fascinating creams and potions and lotions and inventions and books and globes and all kind of, wonderful, interesting objects that are available for sale, and they're also advertised in these newspapers. So they're really a snapshot of kind of Regency life.
Now, in the Bridgerton series, Queen Charlotte actually gets brought one of Lady Whistledown's papers directly to her. How was this gossip and scandal circulated? How could people get their hands on it?
Yes, I mean, in Bridgerton we just see it delivered onto, on a silver platter. so that's how it comes around. I mean, so there's a lot of kind of shops in London where you can, news agents where you can pick up your newspapers from. People pass them around to family and friends. So, they included copies of things and letters that they sent to each other. For men in particular, there was a world of the kind of the club and the coffee house where the latest newspapers would be available to read. So you can sit eating your lamb chops or whatever, reading the Daily Post on your way to Parliament. And so there is a presence, I think, of the printed word in people's houses and shops and streets, which means that, the gossip is there, it's accessible, the news is there. You don't necessarily have to have some kind of secret hotline to the latest, it's not only available to a few, it is available to the many, the kind of information that's been circulated. But I don't know who got it on a silver platter.
I think that really nicely brings me on to my final question for you. And that's, how far do you think that these gossip columns, this printed word of scandal, is the forerunner to the fascination and gossip surrounding celebrity today?
Oh, they're definitely on a kind of continued track. Some of the style, the appetite, the content of the Regency newspapers and the gossip columns are very familiar to us in a kind of world of news that we live in today. You can find it in historical periods in between as well. I mean, the 19th century is also full of these kind of productions and papers and news. It's possible to find a newsworthy scandal in pretty much any decade of history, particularly from the 18th century onwards. So they are very similar. I suppose if we want to speculate and try and look for differences between the past and the present, the people in control of the news has probably changed. There's nothing quite like a kind of modern social media in the past, really. The newspapers don't have the same energy and spirit and complexity of social media reporting, but certainly a public interest in a world of celebrity is very evident in the Regency era.
I think that's a fabulous point to leave us on. Thank you so much for your time today, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Emily.